Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lausanisiris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. We're going to start covering the latest, the 82nd chessanity tournament that took place in Jericho, New York on September 7th. Unfortunately, the webpage with the announcement is not on the internet any longer, so I'm going to explain to you how it works. There are uh, three sections. The one is the quads and the other is the under 600 in the development. How do the quads work? The people that register for the quads are divided into groups of four, meaning the top four rated players is one group. The people rated 5th to 8th is another group. The people rated 9 to 12 is another group, and so on. And in each group, every player plays against the other three players. I happened to have the rated, the top rating with 1582, although it has been raised to 1614 after the New York State. Officially, it was still 1582. I was at the top, and I was at what is called the Quad A, and I had to face the other three players that were rated second, third, and fourth. Time control. 45 minutes with 5 seconds delay. This meant that the players had to complete all their moves in 45 minutes, but when it was their turn to play, for the first 5 seconds, the clock would not go down. After that, it would go down. In this video, I'm going to cover my first game. Just to tell you, since I had higher ratings than everybody, of course, I was the favorite in all three games. In the first game, I faced an opponent who prefers to stay anonymous, and I'm going to respect the wishes. Just to tell in advance, every player that I have identified, I have asked them in advance if it is okay to uh, show the game on my YouTube channel, and only after they agreed, I would show their name and their ratings and everything else. In this case, I'm not going to reveal anything about my opponent, but I'm going to go through the games and the moves. I'm going with the white pieces, my opponent had black. But let's first give a look at the chessboard, chess.com chessboard. On the left side, you're going to see once again the chessboard after every move. I'm going to enter the moves one by one. And on the right side, you're going to see the computer evaluation under the word analysis. Positive means white is better on the computer. Negative means black is better. Computer says if the move played was the best, and if not, which would have been the best move, and which are the best three options for the player whose turn is to come. I had the white, my opponent had the black. I start with my e-pawn, and my opponent plays the French defense. Pawn goes to e6. Second move, my pawn goes to d4, and my opponent replies the standard French way, the pawn goes to d5. And third move, I play the one that may not be the most popular, but for this reason, it might surprise your opponent. My bishop goes to d3. My opponent places his knight on c6. And now we are deviating from the book. The computer thinks that this is inaccuracy, and in fact, even gives me a small advantage of 0.51. I need to be a little careful, however, because if I allow my opponent to take at d4 and then take back at d4, my pawn on d4 is attacked twice. And I may lose the d4 pawn, but let's see how things went. I developed the other knight to f3. Computer thinks the best, but let's see if the idea would work. My opponent takes the e4 pawn, and I take with my bishop. But now my opponent cannot take the d4 pawn because it is defended twice, both by the queen and by my knight. And in this way, I was able to sidestep this trap and lose the pawn. Opponent places bishop on d7. Inaccuracies, the computer wants to develop the other knight. As I say, knights before bishops, even though in the previous game of Team Mirabile, the both players developed their bishops before the knights. I continue. I want to protect this d4 pawn and not always have on guard my queen and my knight, so I can use them for other options. So I send my pawn to c3. The good thing with this move, best as a computer, is it defends the d4 pawn once more, and I don't need to have my queen and my knight stuck at d1 and f3. The bad thing of this move, however, is that the knight from b1 cannot go to c3. The opponent develops now his knight on f6 and attacks my bishop on e4. The bishop goes down to c2, and my opponent develops his bishop on d6. My bishop goes to g5 and pins the knight at f6. My opponent decides to challenge my bishop by moving the pawn to h6. My bishop goes back to h4 to keep the pin, and my opponent castles. And my queen goes now, not the king, the queen goes to d3, and you may see that if the knight on f6 was not there, I would mate. And what I'm thinking to do, inaccuracy is a computer, but sometimes a computer inaccuracy is what is good when humans play. What I'm planning to do if I had a second move in a row is take the bishop, queen takes back, and a checkmate, which I'm not expecting to happen. But instead what happened was pawn goes to g6. You see now, even if I exchange my bishop with the knight, there is no checkmate because of the g6 pawn. But what this does is it weakens the enemy's king because it doesn't have the two pawns in front of it. It has only one pawn. That is quite weak. That's why the computer thinks it's inaccuracy and would rather have the rook go to e8. If I play like that after exchange, h7 is a check, but not a mate. King can go to f8. Queen goes to h8, king goes to e7, and could escape. That's why the computer would prefer that. It would, in fact, not even want me to do the check, the exchange and the check. It would want me after the e8 to just develop my knight to go to d2, as you see, and then castle. But the question is, how do I exploit now this weakness, the weakness in front of the king? Because realizing that there is a weakness is one thing, but exploiting it and win is another thing. And the advantage is quite small, it's 1.10. We completed 10 moves, and this is the current situation. Move number 11, now I follow what the computer says. My knight goes to d2, and my opponent wants to unpin his knight and places his bishop on e7. My knight goes to e4. Mistakes as a computer would rather have me do long castling. What I want to do is I want to start exchanges because with the weaker king, this might make it easier for me to reach the enemy king. Let's see what happened. Knight takes to e4. My bishop takes to e7. I need to be careful how to do because if I take the knight blindly, bishop takes bishop, knight takes, my queen is here. Maybe it may not have been a bad idea. And that is a computer would prefer if I take on e4. But that's not what I did. My bishop went to e7. And now my opponent's ahead, minus 0.21. Black is better. Why? Because there is what is called an intermediate Zwickenzug, intermediate move that I only found after I played my move and I was expecting my opponent to play, that my opponent did not have necessarily to take back my bishop as I was expecting. And this is what is also called a desperado, because the black knight will be lost either way or other, but before it's lost, it grabs a pawn on f2. And I need to take the knight, because if I decide to take the queen, knight takes my queen, and with a check, and then rook takes bishop. So my king takes the knight, and my opponent decides there are two ways to take the bishop, either with the queen or with the knight. He decides to take the knight. My opponent is one pawn ahead and minus 0.29, meaning it is 0.29 ahead after 14 moves. And move 15, I decide now Of course, I didn't know at the time who was ahead and by how much. I knew I was a pawn down, but I wasn't too afraid because the enemy king was quite exposed. But this kind of advantage you must exploit it immediately, because if you go in a quote unquote regular way, you may reach an ending with one pawn less. Then to start exploiting it, start pushing pawn. My pawn from h2 goes to h4. Good as a computer, not the best, and I'm down 0.56. My opponent sends his knight to f5 to start defending and covering quite a lot of squares. For example, the h6 square is not available any longer. The computer thinks a mistake. Now I have the advantage, and let's see why. When I saw the knight on f5, I didn't like the knight being on f5 because it covers quite a lot of squares. h6, I cannot grab the pawn. g7, maybe e7, or even h4 if my rook and knight are not there to support it. That's why I wanted to kick the knight out of f5, and that's why I sent my pawn to g4. Computer would rather have me push the h pawn to h5, but the knight goes to d6, and I don't have to worry about the knight any longer. Game is more or less even, and now I'm pushing the h pawn going to h5. Inaccuracies as a computer, I want to open the enemy king. Problem is, if I'm not careful, also my king can be opened, because let's assume that we exchange the pawns, then my knight on f3 is pinned. My opponent places the queen on f6 to have more defensive power, mistakes the computer, and one way to open the enemy side is by taking these pawns. So it's not enough that the king doesn't have enough pawn coverage. Now pawns fly away. I take the pawn on g6, and my opponent takes the pawn on g6. And basically asks me to exchange queens, which I'm not going to do because my attack is over. The moment queens are off the board. I would do it if I was ahead in material, not when I'm behind. What will I do instead? I know that if I move my queen off the diagonal that goes from b1 to h7, then my bishop threatens the enemy queen. So I place my queen on e2. Why on e2 and not, for example, on d2? On d2 there's a problem that if the knight could go, of course, currently it cannot go safely because the bishop will take it, but if the knight could go there, then we have the royal fork and I lose my queen. Not yet because of my bishop, but I'd rather avoid it. But the computer thinks it's a mistake, and my advantage from 3.30 goes down to 1.89. And the enemy queen, the black queen, has very few squares to go. If it takes the pawn, for example, on g4, my rook goes to g1, and the queen is pinned against the king and is lost. Where else can it go? Not here, not along the diagonal. Perhaps f6, I'm going to push my pawn to g5. Or who knows what. The queen may be forced to go back to e7, d8. Still, it's not lost, but it's out of the game. My opponent decided to do something that I didn't see immediately. I only saw it because my opponent was thinking for quite some time. And while he was thinking, I was thinking, what can my opponent do? So instead of saving his queen, he places his bishop on b5. Inaccuracy to the computer, but when my opponent played it, I thought it was a great move. I cannot take the bishop because the knight protects the bishop. And now we are in a case where both players threaten each other's queen. I send now my queen to d2. Great move, says the computer. And now my opponent really has to think what to do with their queen, and there are not too many places to place it. It's either g7 or f6. Think of it, these are the only safe squares for the queen to go. And as I mentioned, if he takes the pawn on h4, rook goes to g1, and queen is lost for a rook plus a pawn. Opponent decides to place his queen at f6. I would say to my relief, because I didn't know how to continue if it went to g7. Although I was expecting that I could create a stronger attack, but now things are even more concrete. Now I have a nice little pawn. I'm equally material. I take the pawn on h6. Great moves to the computer, material is the same, but look at that. My advantage is 5.96, more than a rook. Queen goes to g7. It could go to e7 or d8 because the queen was threatened, but then it is off the game. Now I bring the other rook to the attack. If I want, I can exchange my get the queen for my two rooks, but this is not a fair exchange. Uh, it doesn't give me an advantage. At best, it might be a fair exchange. It might even be against me. So I want to do something else before sending my rook to h8 check. Queen takes it, and rook takes it, and the king takes it. But at least let's have as much firepower there as possible. The rook from f8 goes to d8 to give to the black king some what's called luft. But the computer thinks that I have made in 8 moves, starting with the rook going to h8 check. Yes, I'm going to lose the two rooks for the queen, but then the queen goes to h6, and I can see it now. Rook goes here, queen takes rook. Rook goes here. Let's follow it. Rook goes here. You'll see it on the little screen to the right of the big screen. Queen takes it. Rook takes it. King takes it. Queen goes to h6. King goes to g8. Bishop goes to h7. And the king can only go back to h8. From here, I had seen this combination, but the problem is the standard way to do it is bishop goes to g6 check, king g8, queen to h7 check, king to f8, and queen to f7 mate. But this is not going to work because the knight at d6 will grab my queen. So although I had seen the beginning of this combination, I didn't see how it concludes successfully. That is why I didn't play this thing. What did I play? Rook goes to h7. Now, from 87, I'm up 17.9. That is almost two queens. The reason I did it is because if the queen takes my rook, then the rook will take the queen, but then the king cannot take the rook because of the bishop. Queen instead goes to f6. Opponent realizes it. Now send the other rook to h6. Once again, the computer thinks that with my rook on h8, I have made in 7 moves. Still, I have an enormous advantage. And now my opponent really don't want to say collapse, but really is in panic mode. Bishop goes to d3. The only good thing of this move is it is going to postpone the inevitable because uh, the computer would rather have the king go to f8 and understand it. But now all my opponent does is giving me a free bishop. Again, now I have mate in 7. King goes to f8. I take the queen for free. In addition to the bishop, I have now a wonderful queen. King goes to e7. My rook goes to h6 to double here, and also my rook was threatened. King goes to d7. My opponent will try to castle backhand at call, but is down a lot of material. Check from e5. King goes to c8. Mate is not so simple any longer. I cannot expect mate in a few moves, but I have such an advantage that if I can exchange pieces and send the game to an ending, most likely I'm going to win. And now I'm going to take a free pawn at f7. But my opponent, instead of directly taking back with the knight and losing a pawn, decides to be tricky, and tricky in the sense to have a little combination, puts the rook on f8. My knight cannot move because it is pinned. But what am I going to do? I'm going to pin my opponent's rook. So my opponent cannot take my knight with a rook. Can take it, of course, with a knight, but then my rook takes the rook. But instead, my opponent does something else. King goes to d7. And now when I start winning the rook, the opponent wins it back. I save my knight with my rook going to h7. But my opponent uses the knight to take my knight and is able to minimize a little bit the difference. Still, I'm winning. Now I have to be careful because the knight on f7 can do what is called a discover check. If I'm not careful where I put my pieces, for example, my bishop on d3, although it's protected by the queen, could be in danger. To avoid any such possibility, I send my king to g3, and the opponent's king goes to c8. And then my queen goes to f4. You see here what's happening. The knight is threatened twice by the rook and by my queen. And if the knight leaves, if it goes anywhere else, there is mate on c7. If it goes to d6 to avoid the mate, I have a free rook. And it's almost a mate. The knight can go back to e8 and it's mate. So at this moment, my opponent resigned. And I start the first game of the 82nd Chessanity tournament with a win. 2 more rounds to go. There are totally 3 rounds. The 4 top-rated players, including me, and at the time, in fact, I was the highest-rated player, are facing each other. I have to face the other 2 players, which I'm going to show in the next videos. Now, I'm Harry Series. This is my grecochess YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. And thanks to all the people that subscribed. If you have not done so, just click the subscribe button. And also thanks to people in the past that have left me some nice encouraging comments. This is my channel Greco Chess, Harry Series. Goodbye.